The gods have throne guardians.
This is a rare Ethiopian Orthodox Bible manuscript.
The Book of Enoch is part of the literature that's trying to explain that.
In 2004, Mel Gibson directed The Passion of the Christ. Shot in Aramaic, Hebrew, and Latin, it depicted the final 12 hours of Jesus' life with a level of unflinching physical brutality that left audiences shaken. Critics called it excessive. Believers called it the most honest depiction of Christ's suffering ever committed to film. On a relatively modest budget, it earned over $610 million worldwide, becoming one of the highest-grossing independent films in cinema history. But Gibson has said repeatedly, across interviews spanning more than 2 decades, that The Passion only told the first half of the story. For 20 years, he has been developing what he calls the project that haunts him, a sequel focused not on the death of Christ, but on what came after. What happened in the hours and days and realms that Scripture touches on only briefly, cryptically, in passages that most Western churchgoers are taught to read as poetry rather than history. That sequel now has a title, The Resurrection of the Christ. It has been split into 2 parts. Part 1 is slated for theatrical release on Good Friday, March 26, 2027, with Part 2 arriving 40 days later on Ascension Day, May 6, 2027, distributed by Lionsgate. The film carries a production budget of $100 million and was shot entirely at Cinecittà Studios in Rome, completed simultaneously with its sequel. After nearly 2 decades in development, including 7 years of script refinement with input from theologians and historians, filming kicked off on October 6, 2025, at Rome's iconic Cinecittà Studios. Additional shooting took place in ancient southern Italian locations, including Matera, Genosa, Gravina, Laterza, Altamira, and Monte Sant'Angelo. Unlike the 2004 original, the sequel features an entirely new cast. Finnish actor Jaakko Odonen takes on a role of Jesus, replacing Jim Caviezel. The reason for the complete recast was straightforward and logistical. Because the story takes place just days after the crucifixion, producers said they opted to recast rather than rely on digital de-aging technology. But the cast is not the most surprising thing about this film. The vision Gibson has described publicly, in interviews on podcasts, in conversations with journalists, is something no Western religious film has ever attempted. Gibson has teased the film as an acid trip, as it explores Christ's time exploring hell, dealing with fallen angels, and the harrowing of hell. In a 2023 interview, he said openly that he had 2 versions of the script, describing one as more structurally traditional, and the other as something resembling a journey through other realms entirely. The Book of Enoch is not considered canonical scripture by most movements of Judaism or branches of Christianity, although it is part of the biblical canon used by the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church and Eritrean Orthodox Tewahedo Church. The older sections of the text are estimated to date to approximately 300 to 200 BC, and the latest part is probably from around 100 BC. That means this book existed for centuries before the birth of Jesus. It was circulating in the same Jewish world in which Jesus walked, preached, and was crucified. And the authors of what became the New Testament knew it well. Evidence of the Book of Enoch's influence can be found in several New Testament passages, notably the Epistle of Jude. Jude 1 verses 14 to 15 explicitly quotes from Enoch's prophecy, suggesting that early Christian authors viewed Enoch as a source of legitimate divine insight. This is not a marginal or disputed point. The Epistle of Jude, which sits inside every version of the Western Bible today, directly quotes a book the Western Church later tried to suppress. The text Jude called prophetic was the same text deemed too dangerous for ordinary believers just a few centuries later. And Jude was not alone. The early 2nd century Epistle of Barnabas makes much use of the Book of Enoch. 2nd and 3rd century church fathers like Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Origen, and Clement of Alexandria all made use of the Book of Enoch. Tertullian, writing between 160 and 230 CE, even called the Book of Enoch Holy Scripture. These were not fringe voices. These were the foundational architects of early Christian thought. They read Enoch, quoted Enoch, and treated it with reverence. Then the councils arrived. The Council of Laodicea, held around 363 to 364 CE, established a list of accepted canonical books and excluded apocryphal texts like Enoch. The Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, led by figures such as Martin Luther, reaffirmed this exclusion by advocating a return to the Hebrew Bible as the Old Testament standard. The text that Tertullian called Holy Scripture was now labeled dangerous. Copies were discouraged. The tradition of reading it as sacred revelation slowly died out across the Mediterranean world. To understand why the Ethiopian preservation matters, you need to understand how Ethiopia came to Christianity in the first place, and how thoroughly it was cut off from the theological politics that reshaped the faith everywhere else. Now we arrive at the part that stops historians cold and raises questions that Western theology has never adequately answered. Chapter 46 of the Book of Enoch, written centuries before the birth of Christ, contains a vision of a divine figure that reads like a detailed preview of the Christ described in the New Testament's Book of Revelation. In Enoch's vision, he beholds the Ancient of Days, whose head was like white wool, and with him another whose countenance resembled that of a man, full of grace, like that of one of the holy angels. Enoch then inquires about this Son of Man, who he is, where he came from, and why he accompanies the Ancient of Days. The answer the angel gives is remarkable. This Son of Man, to whom righteousness belongs, shall reveal all the treasures of that which is concealed, for the Lord of spirits has chosen him, and his portion has surpassed all before the Lord of spirits in everlasting uprightness. This Son of Man shall raise up kings, and the mighty from their couches, and the powerful from their thrones, shall loosen the bridles of the powerful, and break in pieces the teeth of sinners. The question of why these texts were marginalized, excluded, or destroyed is not a mystery if you follow the logic of institutional power. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church follows a unique 81-book biblical canon and belongs to the Oriental Orthodox Communion. Ethiopia's geographical and political isolation from Mediterranean Christianity meant it never participated in the theological standardization that reshaped the faith everywhere else. In the Mediterranean world, that standardization followed a clear political logic. When the Roman Emperor Constantine embraced Christianity in the 4th century, a decentralized spiritual movement with enormous diversity of practice and text had to be transformed into a centralized institution capable of supporting imperial power. That transformation required deciding which texts were canonical, meaning which texts defined what Christianity officially was, and which texts were dangerous. Whether Mel Gibson drew directly from Ethiopian manuscripts or arrived at the same portrait through decades of deep immersion in scripture and theological study, the convergence between what he has described publicly and what the Ethiopian tradition teaches is striking. Gibson has said in multiple interviews that the film will explore Christ moving through multiple heavens, confronting fallen angels, descending into hell, and returning in full cosmic glory. Every one of those elements is described in specific detail in the Ascension of Isaiah, a text preserved most completely in the Ethiopian biblical tradition. The fall of the angels, which Gibson mentioned in his interview with the National Catholic Register as the necessary starting point of the story, is among the central subjects of the Book of Enoch. Gibson has described the project as extraordinarily ambitious, with the narrative expanding beyond the resurrection to encompass cosmic elements, from the fall of the angels to otherworldly realms, which Gibson has famously called an acid trip. The story of the Ethiopian Bible and the portrait of Jesus it preserves is not a story about a conspiracy or a cover-up in the dramatic Hollywood sense. It is something more sobering than that. It is the story of how institutions, even religious ones, perhaps especially religious ones, shape the information their members receive to serve the interests of those who run them. The Book of Enoch was never lost. It was preserved by a community that never stopped believing in it. The Ascension of Isaiah never disappeared. It survived in Guizi, copied by monks who understood that what they held in their hands was not a regional curiosity, but a foundational document of the Christian faith. The portrait of Jesus is a cosmic, pre-existent, multi-dimensional divine being who descended through the heavens, took on human flesh as a deliberate act of concealment, died on a cross as a cosmic rupture, and then resurrected in a release of full divine power that reshaped reality itself. That portrait never died. It just waited. It waited in cliff-face monasteries, in ancient sacred language, in manuscripts that a team of Oxford researchers eventually carbon-dated and verified as among the oldest surviving illuminated Christian texts on Earth. It waited through 17 centuries of deliberate exclusion from Western theological conversation. It waited while billions of people received a softer, smaller, more manageable version of Christ, one that placed them in permanent dependence on institutional intermediaries rather than awakening them to the direct and overwhelming encounter described in the oldest sources. And now, in 2027, courtesy of a filmmaker who spent more than 20 years refusing to let this project die, something of that original portrait is coming to the largest possible screen, in the most public possible way, to an audience that has had almost no preparation for what they are about to see. The question that leaves you with is a simple one. If this portrait of Christ, cosmic, overwhelming, descending through realms, shattering the structures of hell, rising in full radiance, was preserved in Ethiopia all along. What else is sitting in those monasteries right now, waiting to be opened? What other texts were set aside, excluded, or quietly buried that the monks in the Tigray Mountains simply kept copying because they believed it was the truth and the truth deserved to survive? The Ethiopian Bible is not finished revealing what it knows. And if the book of Enoch and the ascension of Isaiah are any indication, what comes next may be even more extraordinary than what we have already found.